Hello, my name is Nick Desbarats. I am an independent educator and consultant in the fields of data visualization and dashboard design. And when I do talks at events like the Data Innovation Summit here, I like to start off with a positive message, something that's maybe even a little bit inspirational and uplifting. But I thought, no, in this case, let's just keep it real. Because this is reality. Most dashboards fail to meet organizations' and users' expectations, traditionally very low levels of user satisfaction. And indeed, within virtually all of the organizations with which I work, users complain that dashboards have too much information on them or not enough information on them. They're either missing information that they need or they just don't look cool enough. And then on the other hand, you have developers who are complaining that users don't even know what they want, or they ask for ridiculous amounts of data to be on the dashboard, but it all has to fit on one screen. And oh, by the way, make it so that it can be printed as well. And they just all want something different. Lots of conflicting requirements. And so the end result here is unfortunate. It's kind of the dark little secret of the dashboard world, which is that the graveyard of abandoned dashboards is unfortunately well populated. So when our dashboard kind of flops with users, our first instinct is often to focus on the visual design, the visual presentation, right? The thought is that making the colors or chart types more visually engaging is going to improve user satisfaction. But when we make changes like this, well, they might revive the interest of users for a short time, but it won't last, right? Usage rates and user satisfaction levels are going to drop back down again very quickly. And this is why making design changes like this is kind of like trying to fix a poorly written document by using fancier fonts or page layouts, right? It's not going to change the fact that it's poorly written. There are more fundamental issues. And so the problem with this dashboard was not that it was visually boring or that it wasn't visually engaging enough, is that it wasn't doing a good job of answering the most common types of questions that users of this dashboard might have. So questions like, is everything okay? Does anything require my attention in here? Or what's the relationship between our expenses and our headcount? Or are we achieving our strategic goals, right? So making this dashboard more visually engaging isn't going to make it any better at answering any of those questions. It's not going to make it any more useful to users. We need to look deeper at how we organize the information and even how we decided what information to even show in this dashboard in the first place. And so to figure out how to make those deeper improvements, we might turn to dashboard experts and ask them questions like, is it okay to put filters on a dashboard? Or, is that a bad practice? Or does everything need to fit on one screen? Or is it okay, for example, to have information kind of below the fold, or maybe to split the information up onto multiple tabs, right? Is that a bad practice? Or should we have one dashboard per role, like a dashboard for the CFO and a different one for the head of HR? Or should we have these kind of multi-role dashboards, for example, an executive dashboard that's designed to be used by the entire executive team? And so if you've ever done any kind of research into dashboard design best practices, you'll quickly find that experts disagree on all of these questions, right? If you ask different experts, you're going to get different answers. But don't worry, it does get worse because most of these experts don't even agree on what a dashboard even is in the first place, right? If you've been paying any attention at all to this field, you know that this is just a decades-old debate. Now, if you were to pick just 1,000 random people and 1,000 random organizations and show them a bunch of different types of information displays and ask them to point to the ones that they would call dashboards, you'd actually probably see a pretty consistent definition emerging, which is that a dashboard is pretty much any display with a bunch of charts on it. If it's a display, it's got a bunch of charts on it, that's a dashboard. And so in that sense, the way that most of us use the term dashboard is kind of like sort of analogous to a term like document, right? Where it's a sort of umbrella term, in this case, for pretty much any set of pages with a bunch of words and images on them. Well, to most of us, that's a document. And so what that means is that, as I said, it's kind of this umbrella term. It includes many different types, everything from patent applications to movie screenplays to news articles. And that's why it doesn't really make much sense to talk about document writing best practices, right? The best practices for writing patent applications have little to do with the best practices for writing poetry or long-form journalism articles, right? Instead, we talk about best practices for writing different types of documents. And so now coming back to dashboard, well, if a dashboard is any display with a bunch of charts on it, it is also going to be an umbrella term for a pretty wide variety of different types. For example, This dashboard, as the creators called it, is essentially kind of a filtering interface for a large data set. You can see the filters along the right-hand side there. This dashboard is actually static, and it's designed to really kind of educate a potentially large audience about the refugee crisis. This is kind of a typical KPI executive dashboard that might be intended for an audience of just one person. This dashboard is supposed to tell me how my workout is going. This one tells me how fast I'm going. And so we have all of these very different types of displays showing different kinds of data for very different audiences. And most importantly, they all serve very different purposes. And so if we talk about any particular or specific dashboard design best practice, what are the chances that that particular best practice is going to apply to all of these different types of displays? Well, zero, or something close to zero anyways, right? It'll apply to some of these types of displays, but there are very few best practices that apply to all of them. And so really what would make more sense if we were to talk about best practices for designing different types of dashboards. But the problem is that we don't have any, right? We basically just have this one word, dashboard, that we use to describe all of these very different types of things as if they were all part of the same category. And I think that ultimately that's why, or one of the main reasons anyways, why dashboards have been letting people down for at least 30 years. I mean, we called them something different in the 80s, but they were basically dashboards. And so we need a different approach, right? We need, one might even say, a reboot. Hopefully a lot of you have seen this show. It's a great British sitcom called The IT Crowd. But yeah, I think we need to change the way that we're designing dashboards. And I think that that reboot, that reset really starts here. We need to stop talking about dashboard design best practices and talk about best practices for designing different types of dashboards. And so I started thinking about this a couple of years ago. And at the time I was wondering, as you're probably wondering now, like, aren't there like thousands of different types of displays with a bunch of charts on them? And then just after, through working with many different companies, looking at hundreds, probably thousands of different dashboards, I found that in fact, no, there aren't thousands, there are about 13, which is actually a pretty manageable number. And so I've organized them into essentially a taxonomy of displays that unfortunately most people call dashboards. At the highest level, my taxonomy has two categories. There are what I call dynamic data displays. And so these, as the name would suggest, are displays that are based on live data. The data might be updated every 10 seconds, it might be updated once a month, but essentially live. And then we have static data displays, which again, as the name would suggest, are displays which are based on a static snapshot of data that may never be updated, or if it is updated, it would only be updated on kind of an ad hoc basis. And if we look at some of the properties of or best practices that are associated with dynamic data displays, we see, for example, really these are the kinds of dashboards that most of you probably deal with. They're for enabling employees, customers, partners of an organization to essentially interact with the organization's data. And so these are your HR dashboards, your sales dashboards, that kind of thing. They tend to have, and in my opinion should have, a subtle conservative visual design. Typically not a lot of storytelling because it's usually not possible, right? These are displays that are based on live data, and so they look different every time somebody looks at them. So it's kind of up to the user to figure out what the story is. They tend to be interactive, sometimes having fairly complex levels of interactivity. And the primary purpose of this type of display, it's all about answering data-related questions. Questions like, is everything okay? Or how many widgets did we sell in Germany in Q4 of last year? Those types of data-related questions. Now, because there are such a wide variety of different types of data-related questions people can have, I have several different types of displays in this dynamic data display category. There are monitoring displays, of which I have 4 subtypes, performance displays, item displays, and what I call canned analysis displays. And I'm going to show examples of each of these in a moment. I'm going to give you kind of a whirlwind tour given the time constraints. And then on the other side, we have our static data displays. And if we look at the characteristics and best practices that are associated with those, we find they're actually all different than the dynamic data displays. For example, yes, they're used inside organizations, but also used outside in things like training programs or marketing campaigns, public awareness campaigns. As opposed to a kind of a conservative design. In this case, we actually want a more kind of slick, eye-catching design. You'll probably want to have a graphic designer involved in this kind of dashboard. Typically involves storytelling. That's definitely a best practice here. And we can do it because this is a snapshot of data that's not updating, so we can tell a story around it. Tend to have pretty simple interactivity, often none, maybe just a set of static charts. And the primary purpose is not so much about answering data-related questions as opposed to causing some kind of desired change in the mind of the audience. For example, we might be trying to persuade them of something, or simply to explain something to them, or possibly just to get their attention. And so I have 3 types of displays in the static data display category. So already we're starting to see pretty significant differences in terms of design best practices depending on what type of dashboard we're actually talking about. So let's dive a little bit deeper. I'm going to start with showing you a couple of examples of what I call monitoring displays. And so monitoring displays at the highest level, they basically enable people to spot new developments that require action currently. And so it's really for, what do I need to react to right now? Secondarily, to maintain situational awareness. So awareness of kind of what's normal and how that's changing over time. The catch is that we have to allow users to do these things in as little time as possible, because how often do they need to scan for new developments that might require action? All the time, right? They never stop. And so it has to be quick, because this is something they're going to be doing every day, week, month. And that's a challenge. It's very difficult to pull off, because nowadays there are often hundreds or even thousands of metrics that could require the attention of even a single user within a single role. And so as a result, most dashboards actually do a really bad job of this, right? Typically, lots of numbers, but no indication of what actually requires attention, just kind of a wall of numbers, or whether the numbers are good or bad. Basically, how should the user feel about these? And so, for example, typical dashboard that might look like this, at first glance looks fine, but there's nothing on here to tell me, basically, is there anything on here that I should pay attention to? What should I pay attention to first? Or are there any crises here? What on here is good news or bad news? No indicator. And so it's going to be very slow for me to visually scan this. And yet, as we saw for monitoring, it has to be quick. Something like this is actually showing about 10 times more information than the dashboard that we were just looking at, but it's actually going to be much faster to visually scan, because I have those dots to basically tell me where I should be paying attention and where, what is good and what is bad on this display. Another reason why many dashboards fail at monitoring is that they attempt to serve very different roles. But the bottom line is that, especially when we're talking about monitoring, different people need to monitor different types of information. And so if we try and create a single dashboard for all roles, or for even 2 or 3 different roles, we end up with kind of a one-size-fits-all dashboard, which in reality, though, as with t-shirts, it's invariably one size fits no one. It basically doesn't serve any role particularly well. And probably the biggest problem with most monitoring dashboards is that they try and do a whole bunch of things other than monitoring. Things like answering analytical questions, or looking up specific values, or storytelling, or performance improvement. But these are all very different tasks that require very different types of displays. So as I mentioned, there are 4 types of displays that I think are required for really successful monitoring. And I'm just going to quickly show you some examples of each. And so the main type are what I call status displays. And so it's basically all the information that a single role, in this case maybe a VP of sales, might need to respond to on a daily basis. Now, in my consulting work, where I design dashboards for clients, I found that actually what's happening much more often now is that all the information that a given role might need to respond to no longer fits on a single display. And so we end up with many status displays showing different aspects of the business. And this is actually too much information for somebody to look at every day, week, or months, right? They're just going to spend all their time on status review. And so instead, this is where the second type of monitoring display comes in, where we basically take all the metrics that are essentially behaving abnormally, and we pull those together on what I call an alert display. And so this is actually pulling information from potentially tens or sometimes even hundreds of thousands of metrics, and just showing me the ones which look like they actually require attention. Now, when I spot something that does look like it requires attention, probably because it's been flagged by one of these dots, well, I'm obviously going to want to kind of diagnose it. I'm going to want to figure out why is it behaving as it is. Oftentimes, our instinct is to try and put that information directly into the dashboard, but each one of these numbers has many, probably dozens, maybe even hundreds of like child metrics and other associated metrics that would be useful in diagnosing it. And so instead, I suggest that we put that information on the third type of monitoring display, which I call a metric diagnostic display. And so this is basically its own dashboard, but all it does is show everything we know about one metric. And so I can basically diagnose it. I can figure out why is it behaving as it is. And then there's one last, fourth type of monitoring display, which is important, which I call a metric introduction display. And so these are actually often just slides that we show people when they're being trained on the dashboard to give them background information, which is often static information about metrics, like where we get the information, how often it's expected to be updated, that kind of thing. And we basically put it on these separate displays so that it doesn't go on the displays that people are looking at every day, week, or month. So that's it for monitoring displays. The next category of displays are what I call performance displays. And so at a high level, performance displays allow users to assess how well the organization is achieving its strategic goals, identify causes of poor performance, and most importantly, identify ways to improve performance in the future. And these are actually very different tasks than monitoring tasks. And so if we were to contrast monitoring versus performance, well, the primary purpose of monitoring displays is really about troubleshooting. It's kind of reactive. It's just, is there anything out there that I need to respond to? Whereas when we're in sort of performance improvement mode, it's all about making changes, being proactive. Typically, monitoring displays we're going to look at a very high frequency, whereas performance displays really only when we're having performance review, performance improvement meetings. Typically, we need a lot more metrics on a performance display. As we've seen, it could be, maybe even thousands that we need to actually represent. Whereas for performance displays, if we've done it right, there's going to be fewer than 20 carefully chosen KPIs. And as we've seen, monitoring displays should be role specific, but performance displays are for the whole team. So it gets us all on the same page, so we're working towards the same goals, which means that the way that we choose which metrics to include is going to be quite different. For monitoring, it's all about any metric that somebody might need to respond to. For performance displays, it's all about choosing meaningful indicators of how well we're progressing towards our strategic goals. And so I have two types of performance displays. There are what I call KPI overview displays. And so these are all of our carefully chosen KPIs that tell us how well we're actually achieving our strategic goals. And then at performance improvement meetings, we would then look at KPI detail displays. So each one of those KPIs has a detailed breakdown that shows us how well it's doing and guides us, most importantly, on how we can maybe improve this metric in the future. And so I tend to think of the difference between monitoring displays and performance displays as being monitoring displays are kind of like sonar screens. We're scanning this huge ocean and just looking for blips, little metrics out there amongst the thousands that require attention. Whereas performance displays are more like report cards. They don't come out very often. They don't contain a lot of information, and it's all about how can you basically improve performance in the future. But unfortunately, almost no organizations understand this important distinction, and they just have the dashboard, which is intended to serve both of these purposes. And so this is an example of what I call a Swiss Army knife display, basically a display that tries to do too many things and therefore ends up doing none of them well. The next type of displays that I want to show you are what I call item displays. And so at a high level, item displays just simply enable users to interact with potentially large data sets, maybe patients or transactions or customers. And so if our data set is actually not too large, we can use the first type of item display, which I call a disaggregated item display. Disaggregated meaning not grouped, right? And so in this case, we only have about 25 or 30 records. In this case, they're hospitals. And we can basically show all of the information. We don't have to just show subtotals or averages. We can show everything. But what if instead of 30 hospitals, we had 10,000 customers? Well, we're not going to show a 10,000 row table. And so then this is where the second type of item display comes in. You've probably seen lots of dashboards like this before, which I call an aggregated item display. Aggregated because we're looking at totals and averages of large numbers of items. I'm not looking at individual customers here because there are thousands of them. And then the final type of dynamic data displays are what I call canned analysis displays. And so these are displays that allow potentially complex analytical tasks to be performed by people who maybe don't have a lot of analytical or statistical sophistication to perform because they've been packaged up behind a simple user interface. And so an example of a canned analysis display might be something like this, where in the upper left here, we can see that there's a setting for the minimum wage, and then somebody can change that to whatever they want and see how that parameter is going to impact the rest of the business. There's lots of complex business logic happening behind this, but as a user, I don't have to understand any of it because it's been sort of packaged up behind this relatively simple user interface. So those are all the types of dynamic data displays. When it comes to static data displays, now I actually don't talk too much about these because as we saw, typically you want a graphic designer involved here, you want somebody with like a visual artist, and well, I'm not that guy, right? I'm not a visual artist. I know a lot about visual perception, but it's not the same thing. But people tend to call these types of displays dashboards, and so I have included them in the taxonomy. We have what I call persuasion displays, which of course, as the name would suggest, are displays for causing people to adopt a certain point of view or take a certain course of action. In this case, it's advocating for more paternal leave in the US. We also have explanation displays where the goal here is not to persuade, it's really just to educate and bring somebody up to speed on a particular topic or situation. And then we have engagement displays. And so in this case, these are displays which are really just designed to get attention. And so in this example, this is showing some potentially dry data, some insurance or mortality data. And you can put in your ethnicity and your gender and your age, and I guess it'll tell you how you're going to die. And so really the interactivity here is more to get attention as opposed to for more kind of analytical purposes. But wasn't my talk supposed to be about the real reasons why so many dashboards disappoint users? Yes, it is, so let me recap. So as we've seen, there are a variety of reasons why dashboards fail. I've talked about a few of them. Probably the number one reason is that most dashboards try to answer too wide a variety, too many different types of data-related questions. They also, especially when it comes to monitoring, they tend to try to serve too many different audiences. And also when it comes to monitoring, they tend to not flag metrics that require attention. And so then we end up with a wall of numbers. So what can you do? What do you do to address at least these problems? Well, first step is we want to avoid making what I call those Swiss Army knife dashboards, and instead break dashboards up into purpose-specific displays. We also want to avoid making one-size-fits-all monitoring dashboards, because as we've seen, we want to make dashboards that are role-specific. And when I say a role, that's not a person, it's more like a job description. And so we might have, for example, a monitoring dashboard for a regional manager role that has 50 people performing it. And we also want to avoid the wall of numbers problem, right? Where it's just a wall of numbers with no indication of where I should be paying attention or what's going well or poorly. And instead, we want to visually flag metrics that require attention on dashboards. This is a whole other topic unto itself, but if we can pull it off, it's really going to make a huge difference in terms of user satisfaction and the overall usefulness of our dashboards. Now, as you can imagine, there are a lot of tips and best practices that go into actually accomplishing these things. And this is why I'm actually in the process of writing these up, at least my recommendations in a book, which unfortunately won't be out until the middle of next year. However, I have started teaching these skills in online workshops, the next one being this coming November. If you're interested, of course, you can visit my website, practicalreporting.com, and find information about that. So thanks very much for watching. I hope that you found this to be interesting and enlightening. And now I think we're going to have a bit of time for some questions.